The year is 1600, and in the city of Rome, a group of Catholic clergymen stand before Pope Clement VIII with an urgent request. Ban this drink, they insist, before it corrupts the faithful. It has crossed the Red Sea from Muslim lands, they warn, carried by merchants and infidels, and it is nothing less than an invention of Satan himself, sent to lure Christian souls away from wine and toward temptation. The Pope, so the story passed down through history goes, asks for a cup before making his judgment. He lifts it to his lips. He tastes the dark, bitter liquid that has already conquered Cairo, Constantinople, and Mecca. And according to the accounts historians have long repeated, he smiles and declares that this drink is so delicious it would be a sin to let only infidels enjoy it. With that, coffee receives what amounts to a papal blessing, and a drink once feared as dangerous becomes, instead, unstoppable. How did a berry from a remote highland forest come to stand trial before the head of the Catholic Church? How did a simple act of chewing wild fruit become a force that would topple monopolies, fund empires, spark revolutions of thought, and drive men to risk execution for the crime of smuggling seeds across borders? This is the story of coffee, not merely a beverage, but one of the most fiercely contested commodities in human history, a substance that moved armies of merchants, inspired religious panic, filled the treasuries of sultans, and quietly fueled the intellectual fires of the Enlightenment. Before it was the fuel of empires, it was nothing more than a wild shrub, growing on the misty slopes of a distant highland unknown to the wider world. To understand how coffee changed civilization, we must begin at the very beginning, in the birthplace of the human species itself, the highlands of Ethiopia. Historians and botanists agree that the coffee plant, Coffea arabica, originated in the forests of what is now southwestern Ethiopia, in a region historically known as Kaffa, a name many scholars believe may be linked to the word coffee itself, though this etymology remains debated among linguists. Long before written records, local communities in this region were almost certainly aware of the energizing effects of the coffee cherry. Ethnobotanists have documented that various Ethiopian peoples traditionally consumed coffee not by brewing it as a drink, but by mixing crushed coffee cherries with animal fat to create an early form of energy bar, believed to have been carried by travelers and warriors for sustained stamina. This practice, documented by later travelers and ethnographers, suggests that the stimulating properties of the coffee plant were recognized centuries, if not millennia, before anyone thought to roast and brew the bean as we know it today. It is here, in this hazy, undocumented past, that the most famous legend in coffee's history takes root. The story of Kaldi, the Ethiopian goat herder, has been told and retold for centuries, though it is crucial to understand, as any responsible historian will tell you, that this tale is almost certainly folklore rather than fact. According to the legend, Kaldi noticed that his goats became unusually energetic, dancing and leaping about after eating the bright red berries of a certain shrub. Curious, he sampled the berries himself and felt a similar surge of energy. He brought the berries to a nearby monastery, where, in one version of the tale, a monk disapproved and threw them into a fire, only for the enticing aroma of roasting coffee to fill the room and inspire the monks to rescue the beans and brew them into a drink to keep themselves alert during nightly prayers. It is a beautiful story, rich with the kind of poetic origin that legends are made of. But historians are quick to note that the earliest written versions of the Kaldi legend do not appear until the 1600s, recorded by a Maronite scholar named Faustus Nyron, more than 1,000 years after coffee's plant believed to have been first used. There is no archaeological or contemporaneous documentary evidence that Kaldi existed at all. What the legend does capture, however, is a deeper truth: that coffee's earliest transformative journey from wild berry to human ritual likely did involve trial, discovery, and eventually a spiritual or religious community that recognized its remarkable power to sustain wakefulness. From these misty highlands, where legend and reality blur together, the real documented story of coffee begins to take a clearer shape once it crosses the narrow waters of the Red Sea into Yemen. It was in Yemen sometime around the 15th century, according to the most credible historical and botanical evidence, that coffee transformed from a regional curiosity into a cultivated crop and a deliberate practice of daily life. Yemeni Sufi mystics, dedicated to their all-night devotional rituals of chanting and prayer, known as dhikr, are widely credited by historians as among the first to brew coffee into the drink resembling what we consume today. The demands of these marathon spiritual sessions required something to keep exhausted worshippers alert through the darkest hours before dawn, and coffee, with its ability to sharpen the mind and banish drowsiness, proved to be exactly what these devoted mystics needed. From Sufi shrines and monasteries, the practice of drinking coffee spread outward into the wider Yemeni population, and it was in the fertile mountain terraces of Yemen that coffee cultivation as an organized agricultural practice truly began. Farmers began deliberately planting and tending coffee shrubs on steep terraced hillsides, developing techniques for harvesting the cherries, drying them, and roasting the beans that would be refined and passed down for generations. Yemen, for a crucial stretch of history, held something no other place on earth possessed. It was the sole source of cultivated coffee for the entire world, and this monopoly would soon become the foundation of extraordinary wealth and fierce, jealous protection. At the heart of this monopoly stood a port that would become legendary in its own right, the port of Mocha on Yemen's Red Sea coast. If you have ever ordered a mocha, you have unknowingly spoken the name of this ancient trading city, whose very name became forever linked to coffee in the global imagination. Mocha's harbor bustled with merchant vessels loading sacks of dried, green coffee beans destined for ports across the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, Egypt, and the wider Ottoman world. Picture the scene: the salt air thick with the earthy scent of coffee cherries drying under the relentless sun. Dock workers hauling burlap sacks onto wooden ships bound for distant harbors, and merchants haggling fiercely over prices in a marketplace that, for a time, controlled one of the most desired commodities on earth. Yemeni authorities understood precisely what treasure they possessed, and to protect their monopoly, they enforced strict controls over the export of coffee. No fertile, viable coffee seeds were permitted to leave the country. Only beans that had been boiled or roasted, rendering them incapable of germination, were allowed onto outbound ships. For generations, this policy successfully guarded Yemen's extraordinary economic advantage, forcing the rest of the world to come to Mocha, hats in hand, for their coffee. From the ports of Yemen, coffee began its slow, steady march across the Islamic world, carried by pilgrims, traders, and travelers, along routes that had long connected the holy cities of Mecca and Medina to the wider Arab world. By the early 1500s, coffee had reached Mecca itself, and it was here, in Islam's holiest city, that coffee found both fervent devotion and fierce opposition, a pattern that would repeat itself across the world for the next 3 centuries. It was also in this period that one of history's most significant social institutions was born: the coffee house, known in Arabic as the kahvekhane. These establishments were unlike anything that had existed before. Within their walls, men gathered not merely to drink, but to talk, debate, play games, listen to music and poetry, discuss politics, and exchange news and ideas from across the known world. The coffee house became, in a very real sense, a new kind of public square, a space of intellectual and social life that cut across the usual rigid boundaries of medieval society. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories that shaped our world, be sure to subscribe and join us for more journeys through history, because what happened next reveals just how powerful and how threatening this humble drink and its gathering places would become. The very qualities that made coffee houses beloved by the common people made them deeply alarming to those in power. In Mecca, in the year 1511, a local governor named Khair Beg, upon discovering men gathered in coffee houses, discussing his own governance and criticizing the authorities, panicked at what he perceived as a den of subversion and ordered coffee banned throughout the city. Coffee, he argued, was an intoxicant forbidden by Islamic law, and coffee houses were breeding grounds for gossip, dissent, and political conspiracy. Yet this ban, like so many that would follow across the centuries, ultimately failed. Historical accounts suggest that the Sultan of Cairo, upon hearing of the prohibition, was reportedly a coffee drinker himself and overturned the ban, and Khair Beg was eventually put to death on unrelated charges of corruption, though some historians debate the precise sequence and motivations behind these events, as records from this period are sometimes fragmentary and contradictory. What remains clear, however, is the pattern this episode established. Again and again, rulers and religious authorities would attempt to suppress coffee and coffee houses, fearing not the drink itself, but the dangerous ideas it seemed to unleash among those who consumed it together in public spaces. Bans would be imposed in Mecca again, in Cairo, and later, most dramatically, in Constantinople. Yet coffee's popularity always proved more resilient than the decrees meant to crush it. By the mid-1500s, coffee had reached the beating heart of the Ottoman Empire itself, Constantinople. The city's first coffee house is generally believed by historians to have opened around 1555, established by merchants from Syria, and the drink quickly captivated Ottoman society at every level, from the humblest tradesman to the Sultan's own court. Ottoman coffee houses became renowned for their elaborate rituals and social customs. The slow, careful preparation of thick, unfiltered coffee in small copper pots called sizvis, the offering of the drink in tiny cups to guests as a sacred act of hospitality, and the leisurely hours spent in conversation, chess, storytelling, and the enjoyment of shadow puppet theater. The Ottoman coffee ceremony became so central to social and even marital life that, according to some historical accounts, a husband's failure to provide his wife with coffee could be considered legitimate grounds for divorce under certain interpretations of Ottoman custom, a detail that speaks volumes about how deeply the drink had woven itself into the fabric of daily existence. Yet even in the empire's own capital, coffee faced its most severe persecution. Sultan Murad IV, who ruled in the early 17th century, viewed coffee houses with deep suspicion as gathering places for sedition and political plotting, and he is documented to have imposed brutal penalties on those caught drinking coffee, with some historical sources describing punishments as severe as execution for repeat offenders. Despite this extraordinary danger, coffee drinking persisted in secret, in back rooms and shuttered houses, testament to just how deeply the drink had already become woven into the daily rhythm of life across the Islamic world. From Constantinople, coffee's story simultaneously unfolded across Persia, Egypt, and North Africa, each culture developing its own distinctive coffee traditions, ceremonies, and social customs, cementing the drink's status as an inseparable part of life, stretching from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the mountains of Persia. But the world beyond the Islamic lands was about to discover coffee for itself, and this discovery would set in motion one of the greatest commercial rivalries in history. European merchants, traders, and travelers passing through Constantinople, Cairo, and other great cities of the Ottoman world encountered coffee and carried word of this strange, dark, bitter drink back to their homelands. By the early 1600s, coffee had arrived in Venice, carried by merchants who had long maintained profitable trade relationships with the Ottoman Empire. Venice, a city built on commerce and cosmopolitan exchange, proved fertile ground for coffee's introduction to Europe, and it was here that the drink first captured European curiosity and European suspicion. Many Europeans regarded this mysterious black beverage from Muslim lands with deep wariness. Some Christian clerics, alarmed by coffee's foreign Islamic origins, denounced it as the invention of Satan, a dangerous intoxicant that threatened to corrupt Christian souls. This suspicion culminated in the dramatic episode with which we began our story: the appeal to Pope Clement VIII to formally ban the drink, and his reported decision, after tasting it himself, to instead give it his blessing. Whether every detail of this famous anecdote occurred precisely as later writers described it remains a subject of some historical debate, as the earliest surviving accounts date from decades after the supposed event. Yet what is not in dispute is the outcome. Coffee was not banned in Catholic Europe, and it began a rapid, unstoppable spread across the continent. From Venice, coffeehouses began appearing across Europe's great cities with astonishing speed. England's first coffeehouse opened in Oxford around 1650, followed shortly by London's first coffeehouse in 1652, and within just a few decades, London alone boasted hundreds of these establishments, each cultivating its own devoted clientele of merchants, writers, scientists, and politicians. Historians have long referred to these English coffee houses by an evocative nickname, the penny universities. For the price of a single penny, the cost of a cup of coffee, any man could enter, sit for hours, and immerse himself in conversation, debate, and the exchange of ideas with people of vastly different backgrounds and professions than his own. Unlike the rigid social hierarchies of the tavern or the private drawing room, the coffeehouse fostered an atmosphere where a merchant might debate philosophy with a scholar, or a scientist might discuss the latest experiments with an interested tradesman. It was in London's coffeehouses that entire industries were born. Lloyd's of London, the great insurance market that still exists in some form today, traces its origins to Edward Lloyd's coffeehouse, where ship captains, merchants, and underwriters gathered to discuss and negotiate marine insurance deals. The stock exchange itself has roots tangled in the coffeehouse culture of this era, as financial dealings and stock trading often took place informally over cups of coffee before eventually formalizing into dedicated institutions. The pattern that had played out in Mecca and Constantinople repeated itself in Europe as well. Authority figures grew nervous about what these free-flowing conversations might produce. In 1675, England's King Charles II attempted to ban coffeehouses entirely, issuing a proclamation that denounced them as places where false, malicious, and scandalous reports were spread, and where idle and disaffected persons gathered to defame the government. The public backlash was so immediate and so fierce that the king was forced to rescind the ban within a matter of days, a remarkable demonstration of just how deeply coffeehouse culture had already rooted itself in English public life. Meanwhile, similar coffeehouse cultures blossomed across the continent. In Paris, where the famous Café Procope opened its doors in 1686 and would later become a gathering place for Enlightenment philosophers. In Vienna, where legend holds that the city's first coffeehouses were stocked with sacks of coffee beans abandoned by the retreating Ottoman army after the failed 1683 siege of the city, though historians note this popular tale simplifies a more complex and gradual introduction of coffee to Austrian society, and across the German states and the Netherlands, where coffeehouses similarly became centers of commerce, conversation, and cultural life. It was within these smoky, bustling rooms, filled with the aroma of roasting beans, that some of the greatest intellectual movements in Western history began to take shape. The Enlightenment, that great flowering of reason, science, and philosophical inquiry that would reshape the modern world, found much of its social fuel in the coffeehouses of London, Paris, and Vienna, where thinkers gathered to challenge old orthodoxies, share new discoveries, and debate the rights of man with a clarity of mind that coffee itself was believed to sharpen. If you're enjoying this journey through coffee's remarkable history, take a moment to like this video, because the story is about to take a dramatic turn. From the halls of intellectual debate to the high-stakes world of imperial espionage and botanical theft. As European demand for coffee exploded throughout the 17th century, the colonial powers of Europe grew increasingly frustrated with their total dependence on Yemeni and Ottoman suppliers for this immensely profitable commodity. Every bean consumed in London, Paris, or Amsterdam still had to be purchased from Arab merchants, who guarded their monopoly jealously and continued to prohibit the export of any fertile coffee seeds. European powers, driven by the immense fortunes at stake, began a determined effort to break this monopoly by any means necessary. And what followed reads like a tale of high-stakes espionage. The Dutch East India Company achieved the first major breakthrough. Around 1616, Dutch traders managed to obtain living coffee plants, and by the 1690s, the Dutch had successfully established coffee cultivation on the island of Java, in what is now Indonesia. This achievement effectively shattered the centuries-old Arab monopoly, and Java would soon become so associated with coffee that Java itself became a common nickname for the drink, a linguistic legacy that persists to this day. The Dutch expanded their coffee cultivation further still, establishing plantations on the island of Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, cementing their position as a dominant new force in the global coffee trade. The French, watching Dutch success with growing envy, entered the race with their own extraordinary tale of botanical daring. In 1714, the mayor of Amsterdam presented a coffee plant as a gift to King Louis XIV of France, and this single seedling was carefully nurtured in the royal greenhouses of Paris. But it was a French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieu who would carry this story into legend. In 1723, de Clieu obtained a cutting from this royal coffee plant and resolved to transport it across the Atlantic to the French colony of Martinique in the Caribbean. According to historical accounts, many of which are drawn from de Clieu's own later writings, the voyage was fraught with peril. Pirates threatened the ship. A jealous rival aboard allegedly attempted to sabotage the fragile plant, and a violent storm nearly capsized the vessel. As fresh water supplies dwindled to dangerously low levels during the long crossing, de Clieu reportedly shared his own meager water ration with the precious plant, prioritizing its survival over his own comfort, determined that this single seedling would survive to take root in the New World. Historians note that while the broad outline of this story is generally accepted, some of its most dramatic details come primarily from de Clue's own account, written years later, and cannot be independently verified with certainty. What is verifiable, however, is the outcome. The coffee plant survived the journey, was successfully planted in Martinique, and from this single seedling, historians estimate that millions of coffee trees across the Caribbean and Latin America would eventually descend, an almost unimaginable legacy from one carefully guarded cutting. Even more consequential still was coffee's arrival in Brazil, a nation that would eventually become the largest coffee producer the world has ever known. According to the most widely repeated historical account, a Brazilian officer named Francisco de Melo Paleta was sent to French Guiana in 1727, ostensibly to help resolve a border dispute between French and Dutch colonial territories, but secretly tasked with acquiring coffee seedlings for Brazil as the French closely guarded their own colonial coffee stocks. The popular legend holds that Paleta charmed the wife of the French colonial governor, and that she, in a gesture of romantic favor, secretly gifted him a bouquet embedded with fertile coffee seeds and cuttings as he departed. While historians treat elements of this romantic tale with appropriate skepticism, given the sparse and sometimes contradictory documentation, what is not disputed is that coffee cultivation began in Brazil around this period and would, over the following 2 centuries, expand into a plantation industry of staggering scale, eventually making Brazil the dominant force in global coffee production for generations to come. This explosive growth of coffee cultivation across the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and beyond came at a profound and tragic human cost that any honest telling of this history must confront directly. The coffee plantations established by European colonial powers in Brazil, the Caribbean, and elsewhere in the Americas were built overwhelmingly on the backs of enslaved Africans, forcibly transported across the Atlantic and subjected to brutal, dehumanizing labor conditions on plantations designed purely for maximum agricultural output and profit. Historians estimate that millions of enslaved people labored, suffered, and died in the cultivation and processing of coffee across the Americas over the course of more than 2 centuries, their unpaid, coerced labor generating extraordinary wealth for European colonial powers and plantation owners, while the enslaved people themselves were afforded none of coffee's profits and few, if any, of its comforts. In Brazil specifically, the coffee industry became so deeply intertwined with the institution of slavery that historians note Brazil did not abolish slavery until 1888, one of the last nations in the Western Hemisphere to do so, in significant part because of the coffee plantation economy's continued economic dependence on enslaved labor. This dark chapter of coffee's history is inseparable from its economic triumph, and any account of coffee's rise to global dominance that ignores this human cost would be fundamentally incomplete and dishonest to the historical record. As coffee cultivation spread across 3 continents throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the drink's economic influence reached almost every corner of global commerce. Coffee became one of the most heavily traded commodities on Earth, reshaping shipping routes as vessels laden with coffee sacks crossed oceans between colonial plantations and European and American ports. Banking and financial institutions grew increasingly entangled with the coffee trade as merchants required credit, insurance, and complex financial instruments to manage the risks of long-distance maritime commerce in a commodity whose value could fluctuate dramatically with each season's harvest. Entire port cities rose and fell in prominence based on their role in the coffee trade, and diplomatic relationships between nations were sometimes shaped in part by the economic stakes tied to coffee production and export. The drink that had begun as a curious regional habit among Ethiopian herders and Yemeni mystics had, within the span of a few centuries, become woven into the very architecture of global trade, finance, and international relations. By the close of the 19th century, coffee had completed an almost unimaginable transformation. What began as wild cherries growing unnoticed in the misty highland forests of Ethiopia had become one of the most valuable and widely traded commodities on the entire planet, cultivated across 4 continents, consumed in nearly every corner of the globe, and embedded so deeply into daily ritual, economic structure, and social life that entire nations had built their economies around its production. Sufi mystics chanting through the night, Ottoman sultans who feared the whispered conversations of coffeehouse patrons, popes weighing spiritual judgment over a single cup, English philosophers debating reason and liberty over pennies worth of the dark brew, sailors risking their lives to smuggle a single, fragile seedling across pirate-infested seas, and countless enslaved men and women whose forced labor built the plantations that fed the world's insatiable thirst. All of these threads, woven together across centuries and continents, tell the story of how a single berry reshaped human civilization. We invite you to share in the comments below which of these historical coffee facts surprised you most, because this story, remarkable as it is, still leaves so much room for wonder. From a goat herder's legend in the Ethiopian highlands to the treasuries of empires, from the whispered debates of banned coffeehouses to the deck of a storm-tossed ship crossing the Atlantic with humanity's future in a single potted plant, coffee's journey remains one of history's most extraordinary tales, proof that even the smallest seed carried far enough can change the world forever.